Hello everybody, happy Saturday morning. This is Rendon. I'm not sure when this video is actually going to come out. I am putting together something right now that's been kind of fun. I won't exactly call it the best build I've ever made, but in some ways it's one of the funnest and more unique ideas that I've actually come up with. Maybe you'll agree with me, maybe you won't. But I kind of wanted to talk about it and a couple of other things. So I put out one dedicated DLC build so far, but I've got like 4, and I'm thinking about 2 more already. I'm not going to talk about every one of them, but I want to talk about some of the ones that are a little bit more interesting. I really like the video making process, and I've kind of started to see that this is maybe half of the enjoyment that I get out of Souls right now. So while this video is for y'all as well, it's really mostly for me, especially in the beginning. When I put together something like this, the time that it's mine is the time that I voice over it, do the editing, and then do the final watches, like maybe 10 or 12 final watches to make sure I'm satisfied with everything. That's the time where I truly feel like it's mine, it's for me. And I feel that I've completed a project for myself that just feels really nice, and I get a sense of accomplishment. Although sometimes I won't lie, just being able to make the build and not talk about it, not do a video on it, and just enjoy it is kind of nice. I don't know if I have an addiction. I probably do. Maybe some people on YouTube besides me do as well. But regardless, here we are. So I've been playing the DLC. I've been invading in the DLC. I know we've had one small patch so far, but not really a big patch to kind of address all the things that are going on right now. With weapons, with setups, all sorts of things. There's a lot of jank, and there's a lot of scary things going on. But I've been in the trenches. Because you know if you're going to be an invader, and you want to make content, or you also just want to get in there and invade, you've got to be in the trenches. When it's good, when it's bad, whenever. Or I guess you could just walk away from the game and enjoy the PvE until it's better. It's actually probably a much healthier option that you should do, but I'm not healthy. Joking. I'm healthy, just not in this game. But maybe I am healthy in this game. I don't know. I guess it depends. Everybody's gauge of healthy for engaging with a video game is different. So you know it is what it is. Now all that being said, I'll stop stalling and I'll actually talk about this a little bit. So you can kind of see what I'm working with. I'll talk about it here in just a second, but I wanted to discuss a little bit about quote-unquote bad setups and the urban brawls that I've been getting into here so far after the Shadow of the Erdtree release. There have been a lot of ranged weapons. I mean, there's a lot of melee weapons too, but a lot of ashes and ranged weapons that have come out recently that don't consume any FP and that do a ton of damage, just about every time they shoot it at you. Or you'll come across players that have that stupid shield that they can just throw constantly like a discount Captain America for basically no FP. You know the kind of players that I'm talking about. But in the midst of all of this spam, there have been some pretty fun things that are being put together. I'm not necessarily going to include my build in that, although I think it has been pretty fun to make. It started off actually kind of funny. I had a pure dexterity build. His name was El the Doubter. The original form was just a dex monster, with Rakshasa's Great Katana, Sword of Night, Claws of Night, all that. He was good, he was a menace, but he kind of just felt like another dex build. And while that's fun, I'll play with it, maybe I'll talk about it, it just didn't really grab me. So one day I was sitting at work, I was just looking on the Gamer Guides wiki, and I came across the Flowerstone Gavel. I was just kind of looking at it, and I noticed that it did all pierce damage. And I thought that was interesting. So I said to myself, okay, well, it'd be kind of neat if you could pair that with maybe something like the Spear Talisman. Maces get 2-handed hyper armor. Maybe you can do some fun, trading with it. And then I just kind of went down a rabbit hole after that. I started off making this a bleed build. It is a bleed build. But I was using some incantations with it, like Blood Boon. And I realized that's not really the route I wanted to go down. When I first started the DLC, I did what I think a lot of people do. I came into the Shadowed Lands and looked around. I looked around and thought, wow, everything is to the left. I'm going to go to the right first. And I came across that NPC that had the Beast Claws. And after dying to him like 4 or 5 times because he's pretty scary and aggressive, I beat him and I picked up the Beast Claws afterwards. And I thought, these don't really interest me, but I'll play around with them and see if I can do something with them. So I was testing out the moveset, and then I put them in my Offhand. And I noticed that when using it, it gives you on the L1 kind of a jumping attack, which doesn't do a lot of poise damage. It shouldn't do a lot of poise damage. But I noticed on my right hand, whatever I was using, the animation came out really fast. After that, I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And I remembered that later on with the Flowerstone Gavel, and I thought, you know, this could work. Obviously, this setup would work with any type of weapon. There's probably far better weapons to use than a hammer, but I made an interesting playstyle that's aggressive, it's fun, has access to hyper armor, although it's very short hyper armor, where I'm hitting people either with the Flowerstone Gavel first, or catching them with the Beast Claws when they roll away, and then chaining the L1 from the Offhand Beast Claws into a subsequent R1 from the Flowerstone Gavel. And I'm doing that in a roll-catch chain until they either roll correctly to get out of it or challenge it. And it works surprisingly well. A lot more than you would think. And you can kind of see it in this video. You've probably already seen it a couple of times already. I've shown some examples that when they get out of the chain and they roll out to a safe distance, they feel like that they can heal. The Ash of War on the Flowerstone Gavel then becomes a great flask punish. Like, it's one of my favorite flask punishes I've ever used. Now this can be, and it has the potential to be, a little spammy. You saw it when I was doing it in that sunflower fight against that group. If I'm going to be in a YouTube video other than my own, I'm going to make you earn it. You can spam it, and it's good for that, especially against a bunch of people. It can really wear down flasks, especially if you're going for a high arcane build like I have here. This build is actually 60 arcane and 30 strength, with 52 vigor. The 52 vigor with the Crimson Amber Talisman plus 3 gives you essentially the same thing as 60 vigor, or pretty close to it. So it unlocks a ton of extra points for me to put into other things. The Ash of War scales with arcane, so I'm getting anywhere from 550 to about 600 AR on that Ash of War every time I use it. So again, really, really great flask punish. I'm going to let this fight play out so you can see how this setup works in a closed environment like a cave with 2 people, and then in the next invasion we'll discuss the chain again. I'll show you the chain here again in a second. You'll see it on this Phantom. Hit him with a gavel first, L1, R1, L1 again. When they roll away, try to hit with that Flowerstone Gavel Ash of War. That's not exactly what the chain was, but you get the idea of what I'm going for now. There are some limitations to this, obviously. Hammers are not incredible. We'll talk about that later. But this is fun, and I really enjoy using it. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that I haven't lost my mind sometimes fighting against certain types of players with this, and that's why other weapons exist. There are some other things that I've thrown onto this build to round it out a little bit. When I started using this setup, actually, my success ratio in the invasions that I was doing on this character went down from the Dex build. I'm not going to put a number on it, but I was doing pretty well before this. I was winning most of the invasions, and then this moved on to about half and half of a success rate after I switched. But that wasn't the point. This was fun, and I was learning how to use it. And that's not irregular for a new setup or build for me until I get it to a good place. And then I start really figuring it out. It becomes a lot more consistent. That's when I'll start to talk about it. I don't really feel like it's good to talk about something until I've got it to a place that I feel like it would actually be useful to somebody who wants to use a similar setup. Although you don't necessarily have to do that. If you want to make something that's fun, you can talk about it. Not all invasions have to be about winning. Most of the time, in fact, I would argue that that's probably not really the point. Some incantations that I've used on the build and kind of still have are Blood Boon. For a little while, I put Blood Flame Talons on it. Bestial Vitality is just a staple that I have on almost every build now. It's just such a clutch incantation to have for invasions. The Wondrous Physic has the Opaline and the Green Burst, which is just that continual stamina regen. I'm trying to chain a lot of attacks together, and And when you have enough stamina to constantly do things, your invasions change so much. You're not waiting on a stamina bar, you're caught a lot less in animations where you just get hit and die because you just ran out of stamina and you couldn't do anything. I would encourage people to really, really press stamina if they can in these. It helps so much to make invasions feel more fluid. And you can escape things a lot better than you would normally die to. It's just something that really, really is worth considering. I mentioned using the Crimson Amber Talisman +3. One of the other talismans that's a real staple on this that I mentioned earlier is the Spear Talisman because of the all pierce damage that I'm doing. You'd be surprised how many people will trade with me while two-handing hyper armor on this hammer. A lot of people like to challenge your aggression in Elden Ring. Good players will challenge, bad players will challenge, because hyper armor has really trained people to just not care and to just swing into your attacks. If you want more details on that, go watch any Rust Bucket video. We'll talk about it. And it works. They can beat me out of the hyper armor on a two-handed hammer, especially if they have a lot of poise and they're using something like a great hammer or a colossal weapon, like this person. But what they're not counting on is that I do have hyper armor, and I'm doing a lot of damage with this Flowerstone Gavel. For a while, I was actually running the two-handed Talisman as well, so I'm doing that in combination with the counterattack damage from the Spear Talisman, and I'm cleaning house with it. People are just not expecting the damage output with how fast I can trade with that hyper armor. But I realized that while trading with this weapon two-handed got me a lot of kills, it also put me in positions that got me killed. Not quite as much, but enough that it made me reconsider going all in on the two-handed Talisman. It's a fun idea to make a build about two-handed trading against bigger weapons and beating people like that. Where they're just like, what the hell happened? But it's not always a winning strategy, and I wanted to tweak it. So again, the main talismans were the Crimson Amber Talisman +3, Spear Talisman, Bull Goats, because I didn't want to have too little poise to be able to actually trade and tank some of those trades, so I put that on there. The two-handed Sword Talisman, or the Lacerating Cross Tree, which I would trade it out for occasionally for that dash attack bonus. I'm not saying that the main hand R1 L1 or offhand L1 into R1 chain was playing into those dash attacks, although maybe there's some, I'll say, chicanery there that might allow or make those dash attacks. I kind of doubt it, but Elden Ring is weird. And the hammer doesn't really have a lot of range, but it can be aggressive, and it can make people really rethink their aggression towards me. And I was landing a whole lot more running or quote-unquote dash attacks than I thought I would, so I stuck with that for a while. But ultimately, what I came to on this was Millicent's prosthesis. The chain, the L1 offhand claws into R1 or R1 into L1, whatever it is, back and forth, as long as that player would let me hit them, I'm building up a lot of those hits and getting access to that damage boost from the Talisman. So I was like, okay, this actually fits really, really well with what I'm trying to do. And it gave me access to the last thing I needed to make it feel really strong, make this build feel really strong, and be able to take on some of those players, playstyles, setups that maybe the Flowerstone Gavel and the offhand Beast Claws just couldn't handle or weren't equipped to deal with. What is that weapon? The Blood Milady, which I don't use all the time, but I've come across players who are using it constantly, and I said, so why can't I use it too? Why not? That and the Cult-Infused Flamberge, which people should understand why that's good inherently. So those two things kind of finished out this build, but I don't need to talk about those because everybody knows why those are good. Not saying they're not interesting. I love the Flamberge, and Blood Milady is very fun, but it's not unique. It's not a cool and interesting thing. Cool and interesting things don't necessarily have to be incredible. They can be interesting without that. I really think they just need to be surprising and work more than a person thinks that they would, and that's worth talking about, and that's what this is. The other thing that this weapon and the whole setup was having an issue with was chasing people down. Elden Ring's been out for a while. The DLC's been out for a while now, I guess about a month. A lot of hosts have become pretty adept at timing rolls to dodge your attacks, running away, and that sort of thing. So while the Flowerstone Gavel Ash of War can catch people in a panic roll, some hosts are a little bit more savvy than that, or they have a little bit more health, or they're just doing a light roll build, and they're rolling too fast for me to hit them, to finish them off. So I was like, okay, well, the Beast Claws might be okay for that, and they are. They're occasionally good for lower poise targets, and what I mean by the Beast Claws, I don't mean the offhand, I mean using them power stance, the power stance Beast Claws. And they are good, especially for lower poise targets, hosts, phantoms, that have like less than 50, 40 poise. I started off using Savage Beast Claws as an Ash on this, but I switched to, I think it's called the Raging Beast Ash of War, whichever one is the one that does that little leap forward and then a rolling claw attack that has some range on it. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. I find myself not really using the Power Stance Beast Claws as much on the build now that I've got the Milady and the Flamberge. In some ways, this build is a little bit meaner than a lot of the builds that I make, but in some other ways, it's also not as mean, which just kind of sounds like me. I've made plenty of builds also where I'm just hard swapping things back and forth depending upon the situation. And I like those builds. Those are fine, especially when I'm not trying to do something specific. If I find weapons I like on a general build I just want to do invasions on, just have some fun doing invasions, that's how I'll play. But if I'm trying to make a themed setup, I like to, as close as possible, make the talismans, the weapons, the playstyle, the setup I have equipped, what I use throughout an entire invasion. Now that is not optimal. I'm not saying you should do that, especially if you're a newer invader. But it kind of increases the role-playing aspect for me, like I'm an entity in this game. I'm just some sort of invader in the actual game that Miyazaki created. Not a gamer, not a player, like an actual lore character, invading you with what I've got. If that's the case, and you were fighting like an NPC in the game, they're not going to be hard swapping a lot of weapons out back and forth. So that's why I do this, why I'm trying to make this as reliable as possible of a setup so that I don't have to hard swap unless I'm coming up on, again, some very specific situations. Now, if I'm playing somebody or a group that's using the sleep crossbow shotgun or something like Bloodflame Blade on the backhand blades, this build is not going to be able to counter that, right? There's not a whole lot of builds right now that are set up to deal with that. In addition, things like Swift Slash or the Death Knight Twin Axes Ash of War are still pretty menacing against this build that I've created. I have come up with a counter somewhat to Swift Slash and the Death Knight Twin Axes Ash of War, and that is the Occult Flamberge with Raptors of the Mist. I don't think I need to explain that. I think that people would probably understand inherently why that would work. If you haven't come up with one yourself, I would recommend you try that. It has worked really, really well for me, and it's helped out a lot in those situations. I also said not too long ago that the Death Knight Twin Axes Ash of War was not that bad. I'm kind of reevaluating that slightly. I still don't think it's a huge issue if you're fighting one person, but you're never just fighting one person. So maybe that needs to be looked at a little bit too. Another weakness this setup has is anything that has a lot of hyper armor, like a great sword two-handed, that you're seeing here. This build will struggle against that. Although that's not rare either. Two-handed greatsword with poise is a very good setup. I remember Fell talking about this in his pick and poker video way back in Dark Souls 3, struggling against passive greatsword players. So, you know, a lot of builds are going to have an issue with this kind of matchup. There's another one later in the next fight, someone who's using power stance straight swords, which have been nerfed, but the way this person was using them made them still pretty good. There is no setup in the game that will not struggle against something, or almost no setup in the game that's an honest setup that will not struggle against something. So that's not really a big deal. If you're making something that's fun and that you're experimenting with, then you're going to have weaknesses. And you can counter those with other weapons, other things you put on the build. That's fine. I was just beating my head against the wall to try to make these things work against stuff that they are not meant to be strong against, and just practicing with them, because there's no better way to practice and get good with something than using it against something that it's not necessarily optimal against. And you can see it. It still works decently well against a good player in this matchup, and in the next matchup you're going to see after this. Again, I've run it into the ground. You get the gist. It's Offhand Beast Claws, Flowerstone Gavel. It's been a ton of fun. It's really, really fun. Now, you can again use this Offhand Beast Claw with any other type of weapon. The first time I tried it, I used it with a Colossal Sword. That came out with a faster animation on the R1 after the Beast Claws too. I've tested Milady in the main hand, and you'll do the Beast Claw L1 followed up by the Milady R1 thrust, which probably will be even better if people are trying to roll away. You'll catch them. Any setup you can think of with Offhand Beast Claws will get that faster animation that I've tested so far. Or maybe it's not a faster animation, maybe it just looks like one, but it feels really fast and it catches people off guard, especially when they're rolling. It feels good, and the stun and stagger I get, even with just a one-handed R1 from a hammer, is a nice way to keep chaining that combo over and over and over again. Alright, you guys did a little bit of a special treat. This is actually post-commentary after patch 1.13. I wanted to include something a little bit here at the end. I've included some annotations throughout the video. Obviously, the patch just came out this week. It's changed a little bit about the build. The offhand L1s on the Beast Claw now do 88 poise damage, which I haven't had a chance to test yet. As of speaking on this video now, it is Tuesday. But by the weekend, I probably will have had some experience with it. So a lot has changed. A lot of the stuff I talked about in this video has changed, but a lot of it has stayed the same. Just wanted to include a little bit here at the end, talking about that. I was going to say here originally that the offhand Beast Claws, as a reminder, do not do that much poise damage. That is now no longer the case. They do a lot more poise damage than they did before. Still not as much as everything else in Elden Ring, but 88 is a hell of a lot different than like 33 or whatever it was before. So I can only imagine this has been buffed slightly, although a lot of things have been buffed, so I'm kind of right back where I started. But that's fine. That's kind of how I like to be. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the rest of this fight. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I will see you guys soon. All right, peace.